Hey everyone, this is Dr. Drizzle and welcome to the National Parks Expedition Challenge. So we are here today in Camillus, New York with a new friend of mine, Duncan Hay, and Duncan is going to take us on a little virtual tour of the Erie Canal and tell us a little bit about the history of it, why it's here. But Duncan, what got you here?
This is like returning to my childhood. This was a dream. I grew up on the banks of the Erie Canal, went away, went to college, did all sorts of stuff, worked for the Park Service in Lowell, Lowell National Historical Park, worked for museums, and then there came an opening to come back to the Erie Canal and back to my home territory.
So how long have you been with the Erie Canal then?
Well, since I was born at one level.
Born.
but
25 years.
Yeah, the National Heritage Corridor was established in 2000, so it's been 19 years now that I've been helping out with the National Heritage Corridor.
Well, we are so glad that you took some time today to talk to us because we know the kids out there are interested in the Erie Canal and they've sung the Erie Canal song in their music classes. So tell us a little bit about the history of the Erie Canal.
The Erie Canal was built from Albany, New York, at the head of tidal navigation on the Hudson, to Lake Erie in the Great Lakes. And they started digging in the middle, and they worked in both ways. They started digging in 1817, and they completed it end to end in 1825. And people thought it was crazy when they did it. The governor at the time, DeWitt Clinton, was the biggest booster for the canal, and they called it Clinton's Ditch or Clinton's Folly. They thought he was mad to be proposing this. But when it was completed, suddenly this canal linked the Atlantic Ocean to the upper Great Lakes. And so farmers in Ohio and Michigan and the Great Lakes states and adjacent parts of Canada suddenly had a market for their produce. And so it went from being subsistence farming for local use to commercial farming for export, because the canal allowed that grain and other produce to go to New York City and cities along the Atlantic seaboard and to Europe. And suddenly America became, was feeding the world from here.
So how long did it take for them to build? So 1817 they started looking.
Yeah, they took about 8 years to build. And they started in the easiest part. They started in the middle, where it was basically just digging dirt in both directions. They didn't have any locks to build. And they worked east and west. And as each section came into operation, first section was completed in 1819, immediately the towns along, well, the hamlets, there weren't really towns or cities in upstate New York at that time. These sort of blossomed, and the population boomed here. And certainly when it was completed, Buffalo became, the second largest city in the state, and a major inland seaport.
Well, who worked on this? What type of people came here to do this kind of work in 1817?
Well, when they first started, a lot of the digging, there were some farmers in the area, and an awful lot of the early construction was done by farmers who did it as winter work.
Okay.
As they got further west, they got into some stuff that required more sophisticated construction or more experienced, and they started bringing in immigrants. There were people from Ireland who had worked in Britain. Britain had a big network of canals by the early 1800s, so you had experienced stonecutters and masons and people experienced with blasting and other sort of heavy construction techniques. So you began to see Irish immigrants coming in. The canal was so successful that less than 10 years after it was opened, it was already clogged with traffic. Oh. And so the state started to enlarge it. They widened it, they deepened it, they built side-by-side lock chambers at each of the locks. And that construction project, which started in the late 1830s, coincided with the Irish potato famine. So the enlargement was largely done by Irish immigrants. Huge numbers of people who were pushed off the land in Ireland, came here, found work on the canal. And then the later generation The canal we use today was constructed in the early 20th century between 1905 and 1918. Most of those workers were Italian. And many of those folks, if you come through upstate New York, the effect of those workers who were recruited in England, brought over, were recruited in Italy, brought over directly, and housed in labor camps, a lot of them stayed. And if you look at the farming and the food that we have in upstate New York, a lot of that benefits from that big influx of Italian workers in the early 20th century.
Very interesting. So back in the time that we were building this, though, we didn't have excavators.
Nope.
So what type of engineering tools did they work with, or was it just grit? I mean, was it just...
Well, a lot of it was pick and shovel work. A lot of pick, shovel, wheelbarrow, heavy manual labor. They had scrapers that they could tow behind horses that would scoop up, probably the equivalent of 8 or 10 shovel loads at a time, so that improved it. One of the sort of clever pieces of construction machinery that they came up with was something to pull stumps, because this was all forest land, or much of it. This was largely unsettled, and so they had a lot of trees to cut down and a lot of stumps to pull before they could even start digging. And so they had this device that relied on the multiplication of force between a wheel and an axle. Hook a chain around the stump, chain goes around an axle, then there's a larger wheel that the horses pulled on, and that mechanical advantage would rip the stump right out of the ground. The thing was mounted on even larger wheels, so it was portable and it could move from site to site, down the construction line.
So the knowledge of simple machines moving into complex machines
Absolutely.
Was very valuable here.
Yeah, no, there was a lot of use of simple machines in the forms of these stump pullers, the derricks that they used in the deep rock cuts out near Lockport, were variations on pulley and rope technologies that we still use today.
Approximately how many locks were created in the Erie Canal?
The Erie Canal had 83 locks originally, and originally they were about 90 feet long and 12 feet wide, and the lift varied. The maximum amount that they could raise and lower a boat at each lock was about 10 feet.
Okay.
And the concentration of those locks had to do with the topography that they had to cross. So, there's a whole lot very close together in the eastern end where they climbed out of the Hudson Valley to get up along the Mohawk, then a gradual climb with a lock every couple of miles or so on the Mohawk Valley. And then the real engineering and hydraulic challenge was they had to go over a drainage divide, so that it's fairly easy when you're going parallel to a river and you've got a water supply where you can tap into that river periodically,
right,
to get water. But in the vicinity of Rome, where they started digging, they actually had to go over the drainage divide between the Hudson River and the St. Lawrence River basins, or the lower Great Lakes basins. And there the challenge is, how do you get a supply of water, because it drained out at both ends of the level. So the area where we're at right now is part of that long level where, or what they call the summit level, where they had to find a supply of water at a higher elevation, tap into streams, and divert that water into the canal to have a steady supply.
So were there true engineers then?
Not really. Most of the people that we call engineers at the time, some of them were land surveyors, some of them were attorneys who had experience using surveying instruments, because a big part of law was real estate law. But there were no formal schools of education in the United States, or no formal schools of engineering, rather, in the United States. The U.S. Military Academy at West Point taught engineering. It was largely engineering in the sense of building fortifications, but the discipline of civil engineering hadn't really gotten started here. So for many of these people, it was on-the-job training. They had some skill in mathematics, they had some skill in surveying, and then learned on the job. There were two people who went to England. England had a pretty well-developed system of canals, and so they went and they studied and they took notes, and they came back and said, well, this is how it's done there, and this is how it's been done, can be done here. But part of this, I mean, a lot of this technology dates to the Renaissance. I mean, if you look in Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks, you'll see designs that he did for the Duke of Milan that look just like the canal, the locks that were being built here on the Erie Canal. So it's not like they were inventing something, they were adapting it to a new landscape, and they were doing it on a much larger scale. I mean, that's one of the things that was really distinctive about the Erie Canal. It was 363 miles long through what was largely wilderness. And while they had built a lot of canals in England and France and other places in Europe, nobody had built anything on this scale before.
So a lot of invention and innovation
Correct.
happened here.
Yeah.
So we're standing on a tow platform or a
Yep,
tow bridge?
well, a tow path, that gravel path, the Erie Canal boats were towed by horses and mules. And so they towed them on that. There was a long rope that extended from the animals to the bow of the boat, and a young person, usually a child, would be driving the animals on the path. Most of these boats operated as family operations. So, you know, Dad and Mom would do the steering, take turns doing the steering. They lived on board, so there was kitchen on board, and the kids often lived up with the animals in the bow of the boat. They had a stable. Everybody worked on a 6-hour shift, so it's 6 hours on, 6 hours off, and it went 24 hours a day. And so they would change out the animals, and people would take, you know, different tasks on the boat or rest on that 6-hour on, 6-hour off schedule.
So I think some of the kids may wonder why they had to be pulled. What was the depth of the canal? Or
when the canal first opened, it was very shallow. It was only 4 feet deep, so about like that. You know, if you fell in, all you had to do was stand up. And it was 4 feet wide, 4 feet deep, 28 feet wide at the bottom, which was just wide enough to allow boats to pass going in opposite directions. What we're looking at now is what's called the enlarged Erie. This is 7 feet deep and a little bit wider,
how is this used today, this area that we're in?
This area where we're in now is used entirely for recreation. We don't see them out today, but there are often people canoeing here. You'll see cyclists, you'll see folks walking the dog, pushing the baby carriage, whatever. This area was rehabilitated by a dedicated group of volunteers. If you had been here 15 years ago, this was largely wasteland and it was abandoned. But the folks here in Camillus have really done a lot and improved the trail, improved the tow path as a trail. Now, much of the towpath, including this section, is part of a trail that goes all the way across New York State. So you can take a bicycle or you can walk from Buffalo to Albany and not get on a highway in most places. About 85% is off-road, and a lot of it looks like this, where you've got a gravel path alongside the water.
So with this not being used for the canal piece anymore, how much is the Erie Canal still used?
The Erie Canal, so the reason that this is no longer in service was that the canal was enlarged and moved to a slightly different location about 12 miles north of here in the early 20th century. And it's up in the Seneca River. It goes through the village of Baldwinsville. And here in the middle part of the state, they did that because the canal was enlarged at a time when Theodore Roosevelt was governor of New York State. He had just come back from the Spanish-American War. He was elected governor of the state, and canals were a real problem. It's like railroads had come into service. Folks were saying, do we even need canals anymore? And Theodore Roosevelt sort of said, well, you know, you either go big or you go home. And they decided to build a canal on a vastly larger scale than this waterway. And so the locks are 3 times as long, they're more than twice as wide, they're twice as deep, they can take much bigger vessels. And then, so this section became, superfluous, it wasn't needed anymore. The traffic on the canal continued to be mostly grain that came out of the Midwest and Canada until about 1959. And in 1959, the St. Lawrence Seaway opened. And now ships could go directly from the upper Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean without having to change cargo. When the Erie Canal was at its prime, they had to have ships on the Great Lakes come to Buffalo, unload onto canal boats. Then those canal boats would go through the Erie Canal to Albany, get towed down the Hudson River by steamboats, and then reload their cargo onto ocean-going vessels in the port of New York. So the handling was a lot more and was fairly expensive. So when the St. Lawrence Seaway opened and they could go directly between the upper Great Lakes and the ocean, commercial traffic on the canal just dropped right off. What we do see today, still on the canal, is the shipment of stuff that's simply too big to ship by road or rail. So for example, General Electric Company has a big plant in Schenectady toward the eastern end of the canal where they build turbine rotors, steam and gas turbines that are used in big power plants. And those things are so big that they either have to be sent out in pieces and then have a crew go out to set them up, right. Or if the plant is located in the right place, they can put them on a barge, ship it through the canal up into the Great Lakes, and then when they get to Duluth at the head of Lake Superior, from there west, the tracks are further apart and the bridges are higher, so they can, so they do that. So we see a lot of this stuff that's just enormous going right. through the canal.
So there's still value. There's still
absolutely,
still using this.
Yeah. The other thing that the canal's used for is it's a water resource. So there are a number of hydroelectric plants that generate electricity using canal water. It's in the western part of the state, it's heavily used for irrigation because the water there comes from Lake Erie, it's abundant. And so the fruit farms in western New York depend on the canal for growing apples and pears and what have you. And it's used for industrial process water by a number of manufacturers.
So still very valuable.
Absolutely, yeah.
So Duncan,
$6.2 billion a year worth of value in non-tourism and non-recreational use.
That's a lot of money, guys.
That's a lot of money, yeah.
So Duncan, I read that you are an industrial archaeologist or industrial, yeah. So what does that mean?
Okay, so industrial archaeology is a British term, and it focuses on trying to understand our industrial past, our industrial history, by using physical objects. I mean, an awful lot of history is based on documents. It's based on the stuff that you find in library and archives. But when you're dealing with engineering, when you're dealing with manufacturing, people didn't always write everything down. And so a lot of our best evidence is found in the structures and the objects themselves. And so, in this case, we didn't have drawings for every detail of the aqueduct, but there were indications in the stonework and in other features that you could say, oh, that's how they did that. That's how they built that.
So you're a very high-level historian, if you will.
Yeah.
I like that, don't you? Yeah. Well, Duncan, that actually leads us to our challenge. And we were talking earlier about we always give students some type of engineering or thinking challenge to do. And you actually talked about one we could introduce to the kids when you were talking about the Roman arches. So let's see if we can talk to them about that. What should they do? What could they research and build that would give them some kind of feel for where we are and what we're doing?
Well, the real engineering challenge is how do you build a structure that can carry a tremendous amount of weight? Now, this aqueduct down here is actually a bridge that carries water and boats. There is a timber, a wood trough that carries the boats, and then there are a series of arches that support the towpath. Those arches are of a design that go back to ancient times that distribute the load both down to the piers and out to the side. So the challenge is work with different assembling, and you can do this with building blocks. Come up with a structure that is stable and strong and can carry a tremendous amount of weight, but also distribute that weight to more stable parts of the structure.
So you heard it, guys. Duncan and I are encouraging you to build a structure that will hold weight and distribute it pretty equally. Using any type of materials that you have around the house or in school. I want you to take a photo of that, and our hashtag will be hashtag Erie Canal, and we will post that to Twitter, and then Duncan and I will look at those and we will try to decide which one looks pretty good and who the future engineers are out there. Duncan, can you tell the kids also, we know sort of what you've done, but before, when you were their age, where were you going with your life career? What did you do or think about that got you into school and here? Or did it take a weird turn?
Oh, it took a weird turn.
Well, we like weird turns. We've done that before.
No, when I grew up, a section of the canal very much like this, a few miles east of here, was just my playground. It's where I went. It's where I rode my bike. I didn't really think of it as history. It was just a feature in the neighborhood. And it was only kind of years later that I kind of went, wow, this is pretty neat, this thing that I used as a playground. But I've always been connected to the water. My mother's family, her parents had a small business where they rented canoes and kayaks to people on a section of the canal. So going to Grandma's house was a matter of getting in a canoe and going out on the Oswego Canal. So along the way, I sort of worked in museums for a long time. I actually went to school to be a museum curator and did that for many years. And at that time, I thought, wow, there are people in this world that are as crazy as I am, and they get paid for it. What a great job.
Right. So communication was probably something, you talked to people a lot, right?
Yeah.
So doing that, and I bet you read a lot too after you.
Well, you read, and mainly it's curiosity. You just stay interested, and what I found, and have found ever since, is that if you're interested in what people are doing, they'll respond to it, and they'll tell you a whole lot more. Whether it's a tugboat captain or a lock operator, or the engineers, that the main thing is be curious, be interested, and talk with folks.
Well, we like to say that you can't be what you can't see. So if you've ever thought you wanted to do something like this and be an industrial archaeologist sort of thing, this is Duncan. He did this by playing around water and riding his bike back in the day, just being curious. We know our 4 C's are communications, critical thinking, collaborations, and creativity. We're adding another one, curiosity. Duncan, thank you so much for being with us today. It is actually beautiful out here. Yeah. I have my coat off. It was cold 2 days ago, but feels pretty good today. Kids, make sure you get on the challenge. Make sure you also tweet out at Dacia92 and hashtag Nat Park Challenge and at NPS Education. We will see you next time. Dr. Drizzle, out.